Hello. Well, I'm recording now the second part of my trilogy of talks, but it doesn't look like the Zoom's working very well because there's a delay between me speaking and the photo of me, or the picture of me. Seems a bit strange, but if it annoys you, you'll just have to look away. But before I start my second part, which is, did Jesus really die? I wanted to tell you this story. It's really quite amazing. Roger Sims was hitchhiking his way home. He'll never forget the day. It was the 7th of May. He was tired and he had a heavy suitcase. He was anxious to take off his army uniform once and for all. He was thumbing a lift. The next car to come past him was a big new black Cadillac. His surprise was great when the car stopped. The passenger's door opened. He ran towards the car and threw the suitcase in the back and thanked the well-dressed man that was the driver. He would have been in his 50s. He told Roger, "Get in the front seat. Are you going home for good now?" And Roger said that he was. "Well, you're in luck," said the driver, "if you're going to Chicago." "Well, not quite that far, but quite near Chicago." "Do you live in Chicago?" And the man answered, "Well, I have a business there. My name is Hanover." They talked about many things on the journey. Roger, who was a committed Christian, felt a prompting to share his faith with this successful businessman about his faith about Jesus. But he kept putting it off until he realized that it really felt God was wanting him to do this. So about 30 minutes away from when he was going to get off, he shared his faith with the businessman. He told him about why Jesus died and rose again. Mr. Hanover pulled over his Cadillac, and Roger thought he was about to be kicked out of the car, but the businessman stopped the engine, bowed his head and said, "Yeah, I believe that. I think I'm ready to ask Jesus into my life and to follow him." He thanked Roger and said, "This is the greatest thing that's ever happened to me." So Roger was dropped off and life went on. Well, 5 years later, by this time, Roger was married and he had a 2-year-old son and his own business. And one day he was going to Chicago on business. So he unpacked the suitcase, or he opened the suitcase rather, to pack it. But as he opened it, a business card fell out. He was given 5 years ago from Hanover Enterprises, what Mr. Hanover had given him. So during his trip, he went to find Hanover Enterprises and said to the secretary that he'd come to see, the receptionist, he'd come to see Mr. Hanover. And she said, "Well, unfortunately, you can't see Mr. Hanover, but you could see his wife." Roger said, "Okay." So he went into this office and Mrs. Hanover's there. She was about 50 and shook his hand. "So you knew my husband, I understand," she said. And Roger explained how 5 years ago, on leaving the army, Mr. Hanover gave him a lift. "Can you tell me what day that was?" she said. He said, "It was May the 5th, exactly 5 years ago, the day I was discharged from the army." And she said, "Well, is there anything special about that day other than that?" And Roger hesitated. What should he tell her? But he told her the truth, how in the journey he felt prompted to tell her husband about Jesus, and that they pulled over on the side of the road and he'd given his life to Jesus. Mrs. Hanover started crying. She sobbed. And through her tears, she said, "I prayed for my husband's salvation for years. I believed that God would save him." "Well, where is he?" said Roger. "He's dead," she said, struggling with the words. "He was in a car crash after he left you. He never got home." You see, I thought that God had not kept his promise. I stopped living for God 5 years ago because I thought he hadn't kept his word. But now I realise that he had. Well, I hope you like that story, but we'll move on to the second section out of the talk. Did Jesus really die? Well, this idea that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, he somehow survived and was buried in the tomb alive and revived, is found in the Quran, which was written in the 7th century. Actually, it's not a very popular theory today, but I wanted to deal with it. So firstly, we'll start at the Garden of Gethsemane. The Gospel writers record that Jesus was sweating blood, Luke 22:44. Now, there is a medical condition called hematidrosis, which is associated with a high degree of stress when a small amount of blood mixes with a person's sweat. This makes the skin fragile and sensitive, so that the later flogging that Jesus experienced would have been agony. We know he was arrested and then sentenced to be flogged. The flogging was usually 39 lashes, but it depended on the mood of the soldier. It was often more. The flogging was done by a leather whip, and tied into the leather whip was little ball bearings and sharp pieces of bone. The back of the person would have been shredded from the shoulder blades all down the back to the buttocks and the back of the legs. Many prisoners died from this beating before they actually got to the cross. We know that Jesus survived, but he would have been in hypothalamic shock, which was blood loss causing fainting. The kidneys stopped producing urine and he would be extremely thirsty. And we know, as he was carrying the beam of the cross, he fell, and Simon of Cyrene had to carry it for him. Now on to the actual crucifixion. 6-inch spikes would have been driven through his wrists, which in that time of the day, in that part of the world, that language of the day, meant the hand. The spike went through the median nerve, which is the largest nerve going into the hand. Imagine if you knock your funny bone, how painful just that is. And that's because the funny bone is connected to another nerve called the ulna. But Jesus would have been in terrible agony as those spikes went through his wrists and his feet. In fact, they had to invent another word for the pain on the cross. Excruciating means out of the cross. Jesus's arms would have been stretched out about 6 inches more than they should, and his shoulders would have been dislocated. Psalm 22 prophesies that my bones are out of joint. The cross was essentially a slow death by asphyxiation. The stress on the muscles and the diaphragm put the chest into the exhaled position. In order to breathe, Jesus would have had to push himself up with using his knee muscles onto his feet that was nailed in order to breathe in. This would go on until total exhaustion. As Jesus' breathing slowed, he went into respiratory acidosis. That is an increase of acidity in the blood. This led to irregular heartbeat. So Jesus would have known he was at the point of death, and so was therefore able to say to God, Lord, into your hands I commit my spirit. One other point I want to mention is made by Alexandra Metherell, a doctor with a science degree and a specialist consultant in various hospitals in America. He tells us that before Jesus died, the hypothalamic shock would have caused sustained rapid heartbeat, resulting in fluid collecting in the membrane around the heart, called pericardial effusion, and also around the lungs, called pleural effusion. So when he died, the soldier shoved his spear into Jesus' side. And John says that blood and water flowed. What would have happened would a lot of blood would have come out, plus some fluid like water. Well, the fluid like water would have come out first and the blood second. John said blood and water flowed because of the copious amounts of blood and the small amount of water-like fluid that came out first. He wouldn't have known what he was reporting, but today we know medically this was a fact showing that Jesus was dead. One more final thing is that the Roman soldiers wouldn't have wanted to risk their own lives by allowing Jesus to survive, because if a prisoner didn't die, they would have been killed. There is absolutely no doubt that Jesus was dead. I've explained in some detail how Jesus died. What about why he died? That is much simpler. He died because of his love for us. It wasn't the nails that held Jesus to the cross. It was his love for us that held him there. God bless. Number 3 and first part will be on the website.